All right, good afternoon, listeners. You're listening today to the Lament of Hope podcast, and I'm here with a good friend of mine, Rachel Hankinson. Rachel and I have been friends, I think, since 29. Is it 2019 or 2019?
Well, I met you in 2018, but
Right.
I think we became closer friends in 2019.
Yeah. And Rachel and I have been on a journey of whole bunch of life stuff that we've seen and been through together. Um,
Mhm.
and one of the things I admire a lot about Rachel and why I asked her to talk today is because Rachel has dealt with chronic illness for the majority of her life. Um, and she is a believer. She's a Christian. She attends her local church in Hamilton. Um, and I just really thought her testimony would be encouraging for listeners just to hear of what it's like to live with daily pain, how she copes with that, how she's walking with the Lord through that. So, Rachel, just kind of to start off, for people who may not know you or just to get a little bit of a backstory, where did you grow up and how did you end up in Virginia?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in I'm in Northern Virginia, Central Ohio, um, in a very, very, very small town. We moved when I was 7 to an even smaller town that's really not even a town. It's more of like a rural village. um, but yeah, I grew up in Ohio. Both my parents are from Ohio. They lived their entire lives there. Um, but yeah, my house that I spent most of my childhood in was on 80 acres of land, with lots of corn and soybeans and cows and more corn and soybeans and cows. But yeah, it was a beautiful area. Ohio is not the nicest state, but the rural areas are just beautiful. So lots of natural beauty. I've spent so much time outside growing up, catching tadpoles and fishing with my dad, and we would go arrowhead hunting in the field next to where we lived. And um, yeah, so it was a very lovely way to grow up. And then I ended up in Virginia because I wanted to go to college in Virginia. So I attended Patrick Henry College and just really fell in love with the Northern Virginia area and didn't really want to go back to Ohio just because there weren't a lot of career opportunities. And it really felt like my community was here in Virginia. Um, so my parents, because I'm their only child, did not want to stay in Ohio if I was not going to come back to Ohio. So their house sold during the pandemic, during really like the height of lockdown in summer of 2020. And we moved to Virginia as a family August of 2020.
Mm.
So they ended up moving like less than 2 miles from my college. So I finished my senior year. And we've all stayed here since because we just love Percival and the surrounding areas. And I think it's been as big of a blessing to them to live here as it has been for me. So yeah, that's how I got here.
And I know you love literature. How did that start?
Um, well, my mom has been a teacher for over 40 years. She's always been a big reader. She's an English and gifted teacher in the public schools for 20 years before I was born. So I was being read to in the womb. Like I've always been surrounded by literature. Um, it was a really big deal that when I was like 6 weeks old, I got my first library card. So yeah, I've always been surrounded by books. We did a literature-based homeschooling curriculum, K through 12. Um, and I kind of felt called to it from a very young age. When I was 5, I like have a very distinct memory of sitting on our couch in our living room and my mom was reading aloud the first Boxcar Children book to me. And I don't think I really had a conception of what an author was at that point.
Mm.
Um, like I knew there was a name on the front of the book, but I didn't really, it hadn't connected yet. But I remember thinking like, I think this is what I'm supposed to do with my life. Like I'm supposed to make these books. I think that's what God wants me to do. And I really want to make other people feel the way I feel when I'm reading this book with my mom. Um, and I never really wavered from that. Like there were different points in my childhood where I wanted to be an author and a ballerina and an author and a doctor or an author and an astronaut. And even in high school when I really got involved with music, specifically piano, um, and my piano teacher was really trying to encourage me to go to music school. Even then I was like, well, then I would be a pianist and an author. um, so yeah, I always knew that writing was what the Lord wanted me to do. Um, and my mom raised me in such a way, and I also just my experience of reading, I know to be true that the best way to become a good writer is to be a good reader. So to
Mhm.
me, it made the most sense to major somewhere that offered a literature degree as opposed to a, a generic English degree that would be geared more towards teaching or a creative writing degree that you didn't read as much. So I really wanted to focus on the literature aspect for my undergrad, which is what led me to PhD because PhD is one of only, I think, three schools on this side of the US that are Christian and offer a literature degree,
Mhm.
which, they've recently changed it to English, but that's a whole other, that would take a whole other meeting worth of conversation to talk about.
What,
So,
through your time and growing up, do you have a book that has been very encouraging to you? Maybe even during the times when you've been sick. Is there a book you just go back to or really love?
probably Lord of the Rings. I first discovered Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit around the time when I first got sick, when I was 11. Because my mom is not a big fantasy reader. My dad is a big reader now, but he hasn't always been. Um, but he's not very familiar with children's lit. But yeah, I remember being in Barnes and Noble and seeing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and be like, "Oh my gosh, mom, this looks amazing!" And she was like, "It's fantasy. You want fantasy books?" Um, so yeah, I read all the books multiple times. And there was even, I distinctly remember a period in high school where I was just too sick to do school. And I didn't really, it was one of many periods that I didn't leave the house for like over a month because I was just so ill. But what I remember about this specific period was it was just so cozy because we had this fireplace in our house and it was very snowy that winter. So I would just sit next to the fireplace and read Lord of the Rings all day. And it was, I mean, I was sick, but it was lovely. I also discovered Harry Potter in high school when I got really sick. And that those were also comforting to me, but I didn't reread them like I reread Lord of the Rings. So
What do you
yeah.
love about Lord of the Rings? What attracted you to it?
Um, I think multiple things. Um, I love how cozy and British the Shire is and how
Yeah.
cozy and British the hobbits are. Um, and I really love how, there's multiple characters that resemble Christ, like Gandalf, Aragorn, Frodo. Um, but, Gandalf asking Frodo to go on this very terrible and heartbreaking and life altering journey that's filled with pain. Um, that Frodo would never choose to go on, but so much beauty coming out of it for the whole world here for the whole world of Middle Earth. Yeah. um, yeah, that just I think that really spoke to me, still speaks to me, of having to endure through difficult things, but there being beauty within the difficult things. Um, yeah, I mean, I could just and the writing is beautiful, the imagery is beautiful, um, very poignant. All
Yeah.
it's like like timeless literature where it just there's always something new to be gleaned from it every time you
Yeah.
read it. There's always something that will speak to you in different seasons of life. So I mean, it's a masterpiece. I love it. So yeah.
What when you were talking about when you were 11 and you started feeling sick, what exactly, how did that start and what was that like?
Yeah. So um when I was 11, Christmas Eve of
It's
what
always
year would that have been?
Christmas.
It was, yeah, I know. It was
On the
Christmas Eve
great
when
days, right?
I know, I started my first period, and I remember being really excited about it, but that quickly ended because it lasted for over 24 days, and it wasn't just like light bleeding, it was really heavy bleeding for 24 days. Um, and so my mom took me to the doctor, and they were like, yeah, this isn't normal. So they put me on birth control to get the bleeding to stop and to try and figure out what was going on. And they thought maybe it was just a fluke that like my very first period was that long. So they took me off the birth control. And that started a cycle for probably the next year or so, 6 months to a year, where I would bleed for 12 days and
Mm.
not bleed for about a day, and then bleed for 12 days, not bleed for a day. And it wasn't, I mean, since then I have experienced some normal periods, but I only through medication, but I mean, I have an understanding of what like a typical flow is for the average person. And for me, it was like gushing. It was huge amounts of blood. And so I very quickly became anemic and um, just very exhausted, all the things that come with being anemic, exhausted all the time, feeling very weak, like I would pass out very easily. Um, so it was really hard because I was a very active child. I was in dance at that point, I think 4 days a week, doing ballet and tap. And um, I was also really, I mean, it wasn't like physically active, but I was really involved with my choir. Um, and went on two, or I went on, yeah, I did go on 2 trips to Europe with them throughout the course of my high school years. And that was just like a lot of practices, a lot of concerts, and you were always standing. So there were a lot of periods where, or points in time where I had to sit when everyone else was standing because I just didn't even have the physical strength to stand for very long periods of time. So it was very abrupt, and strange that, I went from being this incredibly active, energetic child to just like not very
Yeah.
quickly, like literally within a month, that all changed.
And how did that progress after you started having these periods for 6 months to a year of it just 24 days and then it would come back or 12 days coming back? How
Mm-hmm.
did you, did you go back to the doctor and did they run any
Yeah.
tests to help you or?
Yeah. So the biggest like hospital in Ohio for children is Children's Hospital in Columbus. So I started going there to their hematology department. Um, and they eventually diagnosed me with what's called a mild platelet storage pool deficiency, which is basically where your platelets just don't work properly. Um, But the one plus in that diagnosis was that it would never get worse. It would never get better, but it would never get worse. It was a mild disorder, not considered as severe as hemophilia or
Mm.
another really common bleeding disorder called von Willebrand's. It was really rare. Children sent me to a um, basically like a blood disorder conference in Chicago when I was 12 or 13. And there was only, so basically, like 80% of people who have something wrong with their blood have hemophilia, 10% have von Willebrand's disease, and the other 10% are divided into 1% of other rare diseases, like
Huh.
mine was diagnosed at the time. And at this conference of 4,000 people, there was only one other person who had one of those 1% diseases. Everyone else had hemophilia or von Willebrand's disease. So it was very rare, and there wasn't really anyone else who understood what was going on with me,
Mm.
peer wise. And when you're going through puberty as a kid and you're in high school, like no one wants to talk, like especially boys are like, you do not talk about your period, you do not talk about anything like that. Um, so yeah, there was not really like any understanding or people my age who I could like talk to about it. So it was very
Mm.
isolating. Um, so I was just on birth control for a very long time, to treat that. And so
Did it
I
help?
it helped in the sense that like I knew I would only bleed 5 or 6 days. And they were really heavy bleeding days, but then it was guaranteed to stop with the birth control. And I kind of just existed doing that, trying to, I consistently was taking iron and other supplements to prevent being anemic. But that all kind of changed when I turned 16 because everything started getting worse. The pain started getting worse. The bleeding started getting worse.
Mm.
The exhaustion started getting worse. And I knew something was wrong. And I kept going to doctor after I went to over 60 doctors in a year period, trying to find
Wow.
someone who would listen to me, saying, this is getting worse. I was promised it would never get worse, but it is getting worse. And, and I want to know what's going on here.
Mm.
Um, and then it really got worse when I went to a doctor, um, who she connected some dots that I was having migraines at this point, a lot of migraines, and there is a correlation between having what's called ocular migraines and being on birth control. And it's very dangerous to be on birth control if you do have these migraines because it will cause you to have a stroke. And sometimes, as you probably know, stroke results can be permanent damage.
Yeah.
So she took me off, the birth control, and was like, you have literally been, her words were, you have been testing God that you haven't had a stroke yet. And I was 16. Um, so at that point, I was feeling worse. Then I lost my medication, which I didn't want to have a stroke, but so at that point I started taking another medication called tranexamic acid, which I was taking it in pill form. Like they were like this big, like they looked like horse pills. And I would take those to control the bleeding. But like to give you an idea, what I was taking once a day was what they tip, or is that right? It's either once or twice a day. Um, is what they normally give someone after, like through an IV after a major surgery to stop bleeding. And I was taking
Mm.
one or two a
Wow.
day to control my bleeding, just my natural period bleeding, not like something from a major incision or, organ failure.
Yeah.
Um, so finally, after a couple years of being all over the place trying to get answers and having to kind of, I don't know, it was a very discouraging time. And I was in a lot of pain and never felt well. Um, my hematologist, who had been my hematologist up to that point, called me in, to her office and said, I've known for 2 years that you didn't have this blood disorder, but I didn't want to tell you because I thought you would be okay the rest of your life having a false diagnosis. Um,
That's helpful.
yeah, which, now as an adult, I'm like, that woman should have been sued. But, um, and so at that point, they redid every single blood test available in the United States, and all of them came back normal.
Wow.
Um, and so I continued at that point going every week to doctors at Children's Hospital, meeting with just a whole slew of different people, trying to figure out what was going on. I did blood work every week trying to figure out what was going on. And someone finally during that year who was like an intern, she was still in medical school, was like, what she's going through sounds a lot like endometriosis. And that's, I mean, long story short, that's ended up being what it was. So I had surgery for endometriosis. They found endometriosis on my uterus, burned it off. But then the the surgery for that, I bled for 11 months straight after that surgery, which all the doctors agreed, like endometriosis explains a lot of your symptoms and a lot of your sickness, but it can't explain 11 months of bleeding. So since that point, when I was 18, I've lived with an undiagnosed blood disorder. Um, there's theoretically a hematologist in Georgetown who I've had multiple other hematologists tell me like he could probably figure out what's wrong, but he's older and he doesn't accept new patients and he doesn't take my insurance, he doesn't take out of pocket. Um, so I don't really have a way of going to him. Um, so yeah, since then I've just, kind of chilled with I have a blood disorder, no idea what it is, and the endometriosis. And, over the years, I'm now up to 7 chronic illness diagnoses. The endometriosis and the blood disorder are the two major ones, and the major ones that affected my childhood. But I also have asthma that is not genetic asthma. I developed it from having bronchitis over 40 times in high school. So it permanently weakened my lungs.
Mm.
Um, so I have asthma from that. They call it bronchial asthma. Um, and I have irritable bowel syndrome. I have a chronic migraine disorder. Let's see, that's 5. I have, and since college, I've been diagnosed with being pre-diabetic, which is basically like insulin resistance. And then this past weekend, I got diagnosed with Addison's disease, which is where your adrenal glands do not produce enough cortisol, which means your body cannot really handle any kind of stress, because cortisol is the hormone that helps you physically deal with stress, like lowering your heart
Mm.
rate and things like that. So that's me.
What is for the Addison's disease, is there more medication you have to take for that, or is that just something you live with and try to regulate stress yourself?
Now it's something that you have to take medicine for because if it goes
Okay.
untreated, it can be fatal. It's actually what Jane Austen died of, which is really cool. Made me feel kind of better about it because it's like, oh wow, I have something in common with a famous author. Um, but yeah, but it is treatable with medication. So yeah.
How did they find that? Did you just have symptoms of being very sick when stressed, or?
Well, yes, but the issue with Addison's disease and the the opposite problem of Addison's disease, which is called Cushing syndrome, which is where your body makes too much cortisol. Both of the symptom lists for those two things are very similar to tons of other chronic illnesses.
Okay.
So it's very hard to kind of find. So when I started getting on medication for being pre-diabetic this fall, my doctor said, I'm going to do an insulin test, or not insulin, cortisol test, um, to see if you have Cushing's or Addison syndrome, um, just to rule that out of the equation. So I'm really grateful that she knew to even look for that because I'd never even heard of it. So,
Hmm. So, I mean, are you right now, honestly, working through this? Because I know, and especially starting out, um, I think the hope and desire, I know even for me as a believer, or just in general, everyone wants to get better and see some sort of a improvement now or in this life. And honestly, that is the ideal. And in some ways, God did create us at the beginning to be perfect in health. And so now being in a fallen body, there isn't that guarantee of being able to be typical or whatever it is,
yeah,
though, even nowadays, being typical is difficult. You have people have so many different types of things.
yeah.
Um, so how have you worked through that? Like, have you experienced like anger at the Lord? How are you how do you not just grow discouraged and be like, you know what, I just don't see the point? Because it sounds like to me, and from the time I've known you too, it is a lot. Like you deal with pain of something or other almost every day. So there's not really, like you just live with that and you work with it. So how has that worked with your suffering? Because many people would say, I mean, why believe in God anymore, especially having 7 chronic illnesses, none of which seem to be able to go away.
Yeah. Um, I will say an angry high schooler. I really felt like I was being punished, and I didn't understand why I was being punished. I just wanted to live a normal life, and that was um, very hard for me to kind of reconcile my idea of God with the life that I was living.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
but it's very interesting. I think it's very timely that we're having this conversation now because literally last week I had a conversation with someone where they were like, I don't understand how you're just okay with this. Like, you're just okay with being sick. And, it's really crazy. When you know the Lord, he can work anything together for good. um like literally anything. Like, I one of the most impactful books to me in high school was The Hiding Place by Corey Ten Boom. And she talks towards the end of the book about how she met a Nazi officer in a church that she was speaking in, who had brutalized her and her sister in their concentration camp. And he
Mm,
came up to her after she spoke and was like, I've become a Christian. I've been forgiven. I know freedom in Christ. I'm so grateful for you and for your message. Um, and if God can take something like Nazism and World War II and the Holocaust and bring about goodness out of it, not of course that it was a good thing that it happened, but he can bring good out of very painful things. Um, he can definitely do that with me and my my little broken body. It's, I forget if it's First or Second Corinthians, says we have this treasure in jars of clay to know the surpassing power that belongs to God and not to us. And the psalmist says, let these bones that you have broken rejoice. So I really have come to the point where um, I see God's hand so vividly in my illnesses. And I see both in huge ways and in really small ways. Like, we would be here for another hour if I was to tell this story, but God moved some really powerful mountains for me to be able to go to college. And the 4 years that I was in college, I did experience a lot of migraines. The first probably year or so, I experienced a lot of endometriosis pain more than the other 3 years. Um, but for the most part, my health, my 4 years that I was at PHC was the best my health had been since I
mm,
was 11. Um, and, post college, it was better than it is now. So I really see that as the Lord's faithfulness to allow me to be able to get through college. And, it wasn't even just get through college. Like, my senior year, on top of it being during COVID, I was taking 21 credits. I was working 3 jobs, one of them being a head RA, and I developed a literary journal for PHC that's now being taught as a class. Um, like, uh, there are so many things wrong with my body, and the Lord was able to accomplish that through me. Um,
mm,
and like even just like recently when I found out that I had to start taking injections for being pre-diabetic, um, how the Lord provided the right medication at the right time. He provided, it's very expensive, and he provided the funds for the first 6 months of these shots. Um, even just like little things like the fact I was really, I mean, like honestly stressed about how much it would hurt to give myself shots in the stomach. I literally can't even feel it. Like, it hurts less than getting your blood drawn. Like, just little things like that where I'm like, he is so faithful. Um, so I've really come to see it as a blessing. and a way that I get to partake in the sufferings of Christ. Because, everyone's going to suffer here on earth. And if I can show even just one other person how God can be good in the midst of pain and in the midst of difficulty, then like to me, it's 100% worth it. Um, and it's, even I will like even if I don't show someone else that, I feel like I know the Lord more intimately because of this. And I wouldn't take that away for anything. Because I mean, knowing the Lord has far surpassing value to anything else in this life. So, so I am actually grateful that I am sick, and it forces me to rely on the Lord every day. Knowing myself and my like just my innate sense of pride and selfishness, I wouldn't do that otherwise. So I'm grateful that um, this thorn in my side forces me to rely on Him. Um, yeah,
How
I think that answered the question. It was a really long answer. Sorry.
No, it was really good. I was gonna say too, for the days when you feel discouraged, how do you counteract your feelings? Because I know
Mm,
um for me, and I think in general, feelings are very strong, and a lot of times,
mhm.
especially in the times we live in, and as humans,
Yeah.
feelings are how we gauge what we do, what decisions we make, whether or not something's right or wrong. So how do you, when you're feeling like a really hard day, how do you counteract the feelings while at the same time giving you the room to be sad about something that is hard?
hmm Well, I mean, I'm not perfect at this by any stretch. But what I have found to be helpful um, is one, like just surrounding myself with the word, whether that be listening to podcasts or listening to worship music, like filling in blank space, if that makes sense. Like
Hmm.
in the shower, normally that would just be like me alone with my thoughts, trying to like get the heat to the perfect temperature so it's hitting my neck is perfect way so that it's helping the migraine. Um, but I put on like a podcast or worship music. Or like when I'm in the car, I try to do that too. Um, and obviously like time alone with the Lord in his word every day. I try to make a priority of that. Another really big thing is just community. And it's been a learning process of this community that I've been in through PHC and with church, um, that it's very hard to let other people be the hands and feet of Christ for you if
Yeah.
they don't even know what you're going through. So, and I hate asking for help. I have a very independent streak. Um, So, yeah, just learning how to be honest, being like, yeah, I actually am in excruciating amounts of pain right now.
Hmm.
Or, I have to, go to this doctor's appointment tomorrow, or, whatever it may be. Just letting other people be there for you. Like, my community group has been a huge blessing, and just like really being faithful and praying for me about being able to get the shots this fall. And
Hmm.
like I showed up Monday night to community group, and I literally cried for like 30 minutes because I was so frustrated about this Addison's disease thing. um and just them being faithful and knowing what's going on with me. I know that they care, I know that they love me, I know that they're praying for me. Like I get texts almost every day from someone in my community group telling me they're praying for me in very specific ways. So yeah, just and even um, yeah, I think it's important to be honest with yourself and with other people about where you're feeling or what you're feeling and where you're at, because my tendency is to not be honest about that because I don't want to burden anyone. I don't want to throw pity parties.
Hmm.
I don't want anyone to feel sorry for me. But being honest is a different is different than that. So that's something that I'm still trying to learn.
What What piece of music do you think when you were talking about worship music or maybe just music in general, what
Mhm.
piece of music do you think kind of describes your life, like your personality, who you are, if you were to like have a piece of music?
Oh gosh. Um, well, I actually have a playlist on Spotify that's like my songs for that. Um, but I really like this song. It's not a worship song, but I really like it because it's instrumental and there are no words. But it's a flute and piano piece that I actually learned in college with my friend Justine. She played the piano part and I played the flute part. And it's called Summer. It's this composer, like inspired by Vivaldi, created a spring, summer, fall, winter piece for flute and piano. And I absolutely love the summer piece. Um, it's in a minor key, but the whole thing isn't in a minor key. And it's got really fast parts. It's got really slow parts. Like when I listen to it, it's almost like a summer thunderstorm is kind of what it
Mm.
brings to mind. Um, but it's also simultaneously peaceful. It's passionate, which is I really view myself as a passionate person. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I think if I had to say there was a song that described me, I think it would be that. Like, yeah. And I like that it's instrumental because I think, we all have pieces of music with words that we could say describe us at various stages and various points of life. Um, but yeah.
What do you think you would title a book about your life if you write it? Just for people who are listening, Rachel's getting her master's right now,
Oh
in
gosh.
hopes of someday writing a children's book.
Yes.
But if you wrote about your life, maybe you'll never know. Maybe you're going to write a book for children about chronic illness and what it's like being a kid experiencing that, because there's actually
I
more
actually
children
am.
now. Yeah, there's more children now experiencing sickness
Hmm.
very early on. Um, and what do you think you name your book if you wrote about it?
Well, my fantasy middle grade book that I'm writing right now, the main character actually does deal with chronic migraines. Um, so which was not at all something that I never planned on including that in the book, but the more I started writing, she really needed like a thorn in her side, like a typical hero character. And it felt authentic to her character to do that. But as far as like a book about me, I have joked so many times with people that if I had like a biography written about me, I would want it to be called That's the Way the Ball Bounces because that's something that I say all the time. And it's from I Love Lucy. Um, when they're one of their episodes when they're in Hollywood, California, and she's, that's the way the ball bounces. That's the way the cookie crumbles. So that's the way the ball bounces. That's the way the cookie crumbles. That's what my biography title would be.
Meaning, what do you think that means? Like just like you accept life as it comes kind of thing?
Yeah, I think so. But also like I accepting it with humor.
Right,
It's really,
laughing.
yeah, yeah, because I mean, there's a certain sense of levity that I think Christians can have that maybe other people can't particularly access unless they're filled with a lot of apathy. Um, Simply because like we know that this is not all there is. Like this is light and momentary affliction that is preparing us for an eternal reign of glory. Um,
Mm.
you know, God is outside of time, and so there is a version of me outside of time with the Lord completely healed. And when I think about that, like it's not just my body that is completely healed, my spirit is completely healed. And that on
Mm.
it, like I would
Wow.
much rather have a completely healed spirit than a completely healed body. I've learned how to deal with the body part. I'd like the spirit healed. um so yeah, I mean just knowing like this is not all there is and it's okay to laugh about it. Like as you know, like Sunday night, our church did a Thanksgiving service, and this really wonderful lady spoke who took care of her husband who had cancer for 5 years. And she was like,
Yeah.
we laughed a lot. Laughter was important. Laughter is important now. So yeah, I think I've always been very proud of my sense of humor. I recognize that a lot of times I'm only funny to myself. So yes, my I would like my biography title to be slightly humorous.
Well, just to kind of finish off, um, what do you think? How would you encourage a listener who's sick or who has a
Mm,
family member who's sick, um, and wanting to be able to walk with them through it or walk through it themselves in a godly way?
yeah. I think and this is like this is honestly my advice to anybody who's experiencing any kind of pain or confusion. I give this advice to really anybody who will listen to me is to have a mentor. Um,
Mm,
someone who's older and wiser than you, who's had a lot more life experiences than you, to just kind of walk you through painful situations.
mm,
Um, one of my mentors, as you know, passed away earlier this year, but I have two mentors now. I did have three. Um, and I think the biggest gift that the Lord can give us in the midst of suffering is perspective, like his perspective.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and it's really hard to have good perspective if you're just insular, if you're just up in your own thoughts and you're not talking to anybody about them. Yeah, and I think also just be patient. You know, I saw a really funny video on Instagram this week that said, we expect God to act like a microwave, and he's really more like a crock pot. Like you gotta give him some time. You really gotta let it simmer. So yeah, I just with any kind of suffering, it's very rare that things are resolved immediately. And as with chronic illness, the Lord could 100% heal me at any time he wants to, but at least for right now, this is what I'm experiencing.
mm,
I don't, it doesn't appear that it's going to be going away or taken away from me in this life. So yeah, just having patience and recognizing that like the Lord will act, um, but it may not be in the way you think or even in the way you want, but that, he's still good.
mm.
So yeah.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much. And again, listeners, this is Rachel Hankinson.
You didn't ask what my favorite animal
Oh,
is.
I'm sorry. Do you want that
I was
question?
prepared.
Okay,
Yeah, I
Rachel
was
wants this
prepared for that.
question. Okay, Rachel, what kind of animal would you be?
I think I would be a bumblebee because I really like sugar and I am very productive and like I like to be busy and I like to have a mission, like a plan, a goal, and I like living with other bees who are my friends. And I think bumblebees are so cute because they're really like the really round and fuzzy ones and they can fly. So they have lots of like they can see multiple different perspectives of things and they like flowers. I really thought
Wow.
long
Okay,
and
she
hard about
fought through
this.
that one, people. She fought through that one. I think that's the longest answer I've received for that one.
I came prepared.
I think you do, knowing you, that actually goes really well, a bumblebee. You
Thanks.
should put a bumblebee in your fantasy story you're writing.
Not a bad idea. There's a cat, and I don't like cats, so I don't know how he got there. But
Change it to a
yeah,
bumblebee.
add a bumblebee.
Well, listeners, again, this is talking with Rachel Hankinson, and she was talking to me about chronic illness and walking with the Lord through that, as well as just really fun things about literature and bees. So tune in
Thanks for
next
having
time for our
me.
next listener. You're welcome. Bye, Rachel.
Bye.